Welcome to the last event at Scholars at Hogwarts this year. I'm just going to say a word, and then Libby will actually introduce Dimitri today. The reason I'm standing up here is to let you know that Libby will be leaving us at the end of the year, and not leaving UB. But just leaving the position of Executive Director of the Humanities Institute. And I wanted to have a chance to thank her for six and change amazing years.
Six amazing.
6 amazing. 6 amazing years. Just, as an anecdote is when I walked into the position as Humanities Institute Director, we had no one in the office. So that was a time when I had no idea what I was doing. Not that I know now, but I can pretend better. But at the time I didn't even know how to pretend to be Humanities Institute Director. And if it weren't for Libby, I don't know what would have happened to the Institute. I think the Institute is alive because of it. So I just want to say thank you, and here's a round of applause.
Thanks, guys. It's really been such a pleasure to be in this job. I've gotten to work with two great directors, David Castillo and Eric Seaman, and a number of great support staff, especially Maki Tanigaki and Jin Hee-song. So that's been fun, and also just it's a lucky job, and I will explain what's going to happen after I leave. Because you get to interact with really wonderful scholars and thinkers and creators, and it's really enriched my own work. I just finished Haunted Bauhaus, which many of you know, and that book I think wouldn't have been as weird and wonderful as it is, if I can say so, but at least for me it's been weird and wonderful because of you all, so thank you for that. Okay, so I am actually, though, still right now, Libby Otto, the UB Humanities Institute Executive Director. I will be through the summer. And I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the land upon which the University of Buffalo operates and our current location in the city of Buffalo, which are the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home of the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for this opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. So, just in terms of announcements, I wanted to say that this is HI's last official major event of the year, but there is a symposium that happens next week that's sponsored by a few research workshops, HI research workshops, and the symposium is called Madness, Violence, and Technologies of Care. It happens on next Wednesday, which is May 8th, on North Campus in the Student Union, room 330, and the full program is on our website. I'd also like to announce for those of you who really plan in advance that on August 30th, which is the first Friday of the semester, I believe, we'll be running the grant writing workshop for faculty. And that will be, it's a program many of you have gone through. You can do it more than once. We'll have a speaker talk about sort of strategies for grant writing. And then for those who want to, there'll be a lunch, and then there'll be the chance to swap proposals with other people to get peer feedback in a confidential setting. They can be proposals at any stage of development. So we'll announce that more, but just start thinking about, is there something I've been wanting to apply for? And of course, if you don't get our messages, please go to our website and sign up for our listserv. Okay, and for Maki passed me this. Here at Hallwalls, the May 30th is the Hallwalls major fundraiser of the year, which is called AHA. And I believe it's an art auction, is that right? Yeah, it's an art auction. It's May 30th from 7 to 10 p.m. here. And come, buy art, have fun. All right, and then I get to announce the next executive director, who is Christina Maletti. I'm really delighted that she's agreed to take on the position. Many Christina is in UB's English department. She's associate professor, and she is the author of several books and a lot of stories, and her book, Chokebox, A Femme Noire, just came out, so I know she'll do a wonderful job, and I also am sure she's going to enjoy the pleasures of this position. And now, after the longest introduction we've done here for a long time, introduction to the introduction, it is my pleasure to introduce Dimitri Anastasopoulos. Did I do that right?
Yes.
Okay, good. Dimitri is an associate professor of English and the director of the Creative Writing program at UB, where he teaches fiction writing and contemporary literature. He holds an MFA in fiction from Penn State University and a PhD in English from the University of Albany. His fiction articles have appeared in many publications, and he's written 2 novels, both of which were published with Mammoth Books. The first is called A Larger Sense of Harvey, and it came out in 2002. It was characterized by American Book Review as an ambitious, engaging tour de force that breathes new life and perspective into the existential novel. His second novel, Farm for Mutes, came out in 2013. And I really like this. One reviewer wrote that it is, quote, a refreshing read for readers who like their literary escapades with a touch of weird. If anything, the world will seem a little stranger to anyone having read it. Through his clever and compelling prose, Anastasopoulos imbues a creepy air of mystery that permeates this unconventional read. Today, Dimitri will be giving us a talk that is about his next novel. And the talk is called, different than how we announced it, it is called And Give Them the Middle Finger. Please join me in welcoming Dimitri to the podium.
Thank you, Libby. We'll miss you. For those of you that don't know something about the Humanities Institute Fellowship is that we often get together with our colleagues and have lunches and talk about the talks, and Libby's always there, her presence is always there, but this has just been a fantastic year and semester of doing that. It's not only, the time to write is fantastic and much appreciated, but that experience of having that interlocution has been great. So thank you to the Humanities Institute for that, and to Hall Walls for hosting this. So and Give Them the Middle Finger, the title of the talk. I know I annoyed some of you with the Ramones playing over and over, but that's been a theme for me as I've been writing this, precisely because my general sense of my topic, which is essentially the Greek crisis, economic crisis of the last 10 years, is that basically it's been this vindictive, violent assault on the Greek people. And so the Tim Geithner quote, which was, they wanted to take baseball bats to their heads. I said, oh yeah, that's like the Ramones song, beat on the bread with a baseball bat. What can you do? I always thought, this week I discovered, I bought the song on iTunes, and I discovered that the lyric is not what I thought it was for the last 30 years. I always used to think it was, beat on the brat with a baseball bat, what can you do with a brat like that? No, it's not your fault. I thought it was. That's not the lyric, apparently. It's something else, which is nowhere near as good as my lyric. Anyway, sometimes songs run behind my head as I'm trying to write, and as annoying as that song is, it did. That's what's going on. So, And Give Them the Middle Finger is part of the novel. Everything I'm going to talk about today is actually content in the novel. So the novel encompasses current events, the Eurozone crisis, history, politics, but also autobiography, being in Greece with my family. There are sort of 2 thematic concerns in the novel through which I divide all those things, and I'll explain what those are. But if it seems like I'm just doing exposition about what the novel's about, in point of fact, everything in here is actually in the novel. I consider some of what I'm doing like some kind of tragic comedy, and I think it's funny. as I was going over some of this, a lot of this was on finance and economics, and I thought to myself, oh boy, like I think it's funny, but it might be pretty dry, so I have a concern there. This is just, this line, and give them the middle finger, comes from a speech that this is the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis. And he gave a speech long before he became a politician and a cabinet member at a subversive festival in Croatia. And this is just a throwaway line where he was trying to contextualize some of the things happening in Greece. And he said, and give them the middle finger. And this became a super scandal in Europe. But it was, he was an academic. I actually was in touch with him in about 2010 about several things that had to do with stat keeping in Greece. And this was just a couple years later. He was working for a software company, a game company in Seattle at the time. And he went to this festival in Croatia, and he gave a talk that, this talk, and I'll discuss this at the very end, was the basis for a kind of, I don't know, it was a character attack. He was basically deposed from his position because of this talk, which was shown ex post facto. And it was what I consider kind of the end for any sort of resistance Greece had to the austerity imposed upon it, because he was the only one who had a plan for Greece, and it was a good and viable plan. And after this, it was done, it was over. Badiou basically talks about him in this moment and thinks about what was lost because of this line, and give them the middle finger. But I like it especially because it begs context, like what's the and about? And this is exactly what was missing in any critique of it. So anyway, maybe you'll get a sense of the architecture or scaffolding for the novel from a lot of what I'm going to describe. But one thing to keep in mind, what I'm trying to do here is, a lot of it will sound like a screed, like a reactionary defense of Greece. A lot of the novel is precisely that. Like, in many ways, I think I have all the facts to back it up, but it's in the presentation, the sort of narrative sequence that I choose in order to do that kind of defense that I think some of my interest is in. But another part of it deals with certain Greek cultural traits and sort of losses in translation when people are trying to understand what the Greek crisis was about. Nowadays, you don't hear anything about it, but from 2010 to 2015, it was constantly on the front page of the New York Times. People were talking about it. It was a thing. Like, it's not just that Greece is unimportant, but it's not just that Greece was suddenly important for 5 years, but that this became a point of discussion. So what drew my interest initially was just media coverage that treated what was going on in Greece as a kind of morality tale for essentially economics and finance in the entire world. And I found that quite interesting. But a lot of the evidence to support people's positions would come in what I consider peculiar ways. So I'll begin with that a little bit. Greek morality tales. So this is just here because I think this happens a lot in any kind of critical discourse in which there's a left and a right, in which these things are opposed. But for many people on the left, the big story was tax evasion in Greece. This is what happens when rich people refuse to pay your taxes. You don't have any money to carry your country forth. And for a whole other set of people, it was the socialism in Greece. This is one of the defense. Greece actually never had socialism. Greece has always been a libertarian's paradise. There are no social services in Greece. They did run out of money though. So anyway, those were the two main ways that the lens through which people saw Greece. Michael Lewis, I know we started the semester when Chad talked about the semester, the year of humanities fellowships, when Tad brought up Michael Lewis. He's a big figure in some of what I'm doing. He wrote a piece in Vanity Fair called "Beware of Greeks Bearing Bonds." This was one of his quotes. Different societies were touched by the meltdown. Each responded in its own peculiar way. No response was as peculiar as the Greeks, however. Anyone who had spent even a few days talking to people there could see that. And I really want, if I could highlight this again, I would highlight the last little phrase. Anyone who had spent a few days there could see that, talking to people there could see that. Literally what Michael Lewis did, he did a drive-by, drop-in, just flew to Greece a couple days, interviewed people over lunch and coffee, and he met a lot of people actually, he just listed them. His sense of how the Greeks were treating the crisis and what they were telling him, I thought was precisely on target, even though it was misunderstood. And his sense was that they were, he felt like they were in a confessional booth. This was like a form of expiation for them. They were going to tell him everything that they had done, what their culpability was, and then they were just going to, well, it was an interesting part when he was talking about this. He talked to 2 tax collectors who tried to describe to him, the difficulty they had in their jobs. And they would talk about the things they had done in order to survive in their jobs, which were totally unethical. So, it's confession. But the interesting part about it, in this article that he wrote, was that he had to meet these 2 tax collectors that were in the same office. He had to meet with them separately because they hated one another. And they would only say absolutely the harshest things about one another. So along with this kind of confessional or expiation, there was this shift into blame giving. Now, thinking about these things as a cultural trait, first of all, the venue for his research. Sitting with Greeks at cafes or bars to talk with them, there can't be a more stereotypical approach to finding something out about Greece. In the culture, there's this thing about being a conversationalist or actually leaving the household. You have to get out every day and sit and drink your coffee and have conversations. It's a very big deal. But as part of it, there are parts of rhetorical discourse that Greeks will use. Something like exaggerating, confessionals, expiation. These things are part of the discourse. And I'll show you how Varoufakis uses this kind of rhetoric in a second. But I thought it was interesting that Lewis, because what he did and what he heard, immediately wrote this article. And he came to one of the biggest turnarounds in terms of morality tales that I think you can possibly construct. This is the quote from the article that I just love. If there were any justice in the world, the Greek bankers would be in the streets marching to protest the morals of the ordinary Greek citizens. This construction is just absolutely fantastic. And it's what happens when you go to listen to Greeks criticizing themselves instead of the banks. And it's precisely what happened. Anyway, there is something behind this. There is a basis. It's just the real basis is that Greek banks didn't get involved with New York City and Wall Street in the economic meltdown. They were, for all purposes, solvent. Greece was a weird case. If you look at the countries that had a big trouble with the meltdown, a lot of their banks got involved with Wall Street. In a lot of these countries, the credit bubble that we know about from 2008, it really burst because there was a lot of private debt. Greece was no such. Private debt in Greece was minimal. It was like 25% of GDP. A lot of other European countries were well over 300%. Greece's credit bubble was taken on by the state. Greece had huge public debt, no private debt. Home ownership in Greece is something like 90%. These homes are passed down from generation to generation. It's very hard to buy a new place in Greece. Families live together for a very long time. So anyway, this is where he's getting this sense that the Greek bankers were not to blame. So in part of writing this novel, I've written much of the sort of autobiography, the sort of experience in Greece. And I think of that side as being the confessional side. What I'm going to do today is mainly the sort of reactionary screed that rejects almost every given common story or myth about Greece. So I'll try to run through that as quickly as I can. This is the view of Greece, inside Greece. It's a quote from 25 years ago by Anaxagoras, and I think not much has changed. It captures the Greek mentality. That Greece is this grand place still and very important to the world. It's not much smaller, or is it? A little bit bigger than Greece. So the sense inside Greece, which is really bizarre and strange, was that Greece was suddenly the center of this Eurozone meltdown, and that as such it had gained some kind of importance within the Eurozone that was an outlier. I mean, Greece is a country of 11 million people, and small. I mean, I think its GDP is maybe 5 or 6% of European GDP, so relatively, it matters very little by comparison. So, a lot of times in the negotiations to save Greece, to bail Greece out, to bail its finances out, people would come up to Varoufakis, the finance minister, and they would make that point precisely. You Greeks think you're a lot more important than you are. We'll toss you out of the Eurozone in an instant. You're totally expendable. And Varoufakis would take what they'd say, and he would basically agree with them. But he would exaggerate it even more. Like, he would vilify the Greeks. He would say, we are basically totally meaningless. You should forget us and have nothing to do with us, toss us out. This was just his manner of political speaking, I suppose. He's a little bit bizarre in that way, but what he wanted to highlight was the fact that Greece had suddenly occupied the world's newspapers. It had become a big thing. And so for him, the question was why? Why was Greece imbricated with the Eurozone in this way? And one of the things Varoufakis was always pretty good at saying in turning this question and asking about the rationale for anyone even caring about Greece was in pointing to other countries in Europe that were even smaller than Greece, like Portugal would be the prime example, had fewer citizens, a smaller GDP, but Portugal was even more imbricated within the European project than Greece was. And by that I mean in terms of capital, in terms of the complexity of finance. What it really means is the Portuguese, he would point to the Portuguese and how they had this very high private debt, that this private debt was purchased through Spanish banks, and that the collapse of Portugal could mean the collapse of Spanish banks. And if you know anything about Spain and Italy, these are two countries in Europe that are way, way too big to fail. They're protected by the fact that they're integral. Greece could be kicked out and the Eurozone would stay together once it was ring-fenced properly. But that could never happen to Spain or Italy. And Spain in particular, in many ways was economically imbricated with Portugal in a way that protected Portugal. So this quote in particular I just find to be an example of Varoufakis's rhetoric, his one way that he would sort of play on this idea of the critique of Greece, Greeks thinking they were the center of Europe when they were not. I'm going to move away a little bit. I'm going to bring back the question of rhetoric and expression a little bit later and describe how it impacted the writing of the novel. I'm going to step back a little bit. This is a quote from John Kay, a columnist in the Financial Times. And the significance of this quote for me is that coming after the 2008 meltdown and the Eurozone crisis with the possible dissolution of the Euro, Kay was tracking in his talks with finance people, economists, but also politicians, this peculiar and constant emphasis in his talks on the word credibility. And this doesn't read, ironically, so much The context for it is he presented as irony, but I mean, more or less it can be a kind of straightforward neoliberal sense of how finance should happen. The behavior of companies and households depends on their expectations of the future. If these incorporate all knowable information and governments lay out consistent fiscal and monetary plans for sustainable public finances and low inflation, the best course for companies and households is to adjust to a new equilibrium consistent with prudent budgets and price stability. The key is the credibility of the plan for price stability. Arguments based on faith are impossible to refute. If magic fails, it's because we don't believe enough in magic. If credibility fails to bring about the desired outcome, it's because our commitment is too weak to establish credibility. Sophisticated market participants base prognostication not on a detailed understanding of future public finances, but on conventional wisdom and on what they have just read in the news or seen on television. I mean, I can see how the irony might be totally missing in a sort of straight reading of this. This is actually how finance happens. That's all he's writing about. That if someone has a plan, basically a financial plan for the organization and construction of the Eurozone in crisis, if a bunch of economists get together and finance people and say, that's a horrible plan, it will never work, what are you doing? This is just leading us to disaster. The rejoinder will be, it's because you don't have the confidence in it, and it doesn't have the credibility because you have not put your faith into it. You can't adopt something you don't believe in. So this is by and large also how the EU approached that Euro crisis. That you had these points where people were basically upbraided for their moral failings. They needed to get with the program, that it would only work if everyone was adopting the same financial program. We had Nobel Prize winners, mainly from the US and the UK. So they're automatically going to be pushed aside that said, well, actually, when you have this sort of quasi-depression, you have to do sort of pro-cyclical spending to get yourself out of it instead of these austerity programs. I'll mention the IMF at the very end, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who revealed at the very end that everyone inside the IMF was basically in agreement that the proper prescription for what was going on was not being followed, but they went along with the program anyway. It's precisely this question of credibility. There's a couple academics who deal with this question post-2008, thinking of derivatives. And one is Arjun Appadurai, who's in media and communications. He wrote a book called Banking on Words, The Failure of Language in the Age of Derivative Finance. Trading is closely connected to writing, that is the making of written agreements between traders who commit to acts of buying and selling. The severance of the price of derivatives from the universe of numbers, and thus of probability, renders the entire history of financial economics in its quantitative phase into the history of an error. So the way I parse this is that in thinking about derivatives, these instruments that are traded to basically as insurance, to somehow protect yourself from risk, they're not based on any sort of statistical relation with, let's say if you're a bank, with the kind of assets you have. They're there to supposedly gauge markets and how people are buying and trading these derivative instruments. They're supposed to tell you, well, if everyone is paying this amount to insure, let's say, real estate property in the USA, that must mean that those people know what they're doing because they're buying and selling it. It's reaching an equilibrium, and therefore our sense of how much risk is at stake in the market is based on that. It basically goes back to the K quote. Appadurai is interesting because he uses J.L. Austin to do this sort of genealogy of derivatives. Derivatives came about in the aughts. I mean, probably by 2002, 2003 is when they first started building up. And he just does case studies of who invented this particular derivative. Why did they call it that? What was it supposed to do? If you've read Michael Lewis's The Big Short, you see the Dr. Burry, who called up a trading house one day, and he said, I would like to short people who are purchasing this derivative on housing in South Florida. And the answer was, what are you talking about? We don't sell anything like that. And he was like, well, can you create it for me? And they were like, well, I guess we can. So they just created these things out of whole cloth. For Epidurai, he thinks this is quite performative in how these things were described, because they were described in language. There was basically, the math behind them was almost purely non-existent. They were created whole cloth and sold. The next one is Eli Ayashi, who wrote The Blank Swan, The End of Probability. And he says the market, so far as financial tools are concerned, is not a reflective or post hoc process for aggregating, mediating, or commensurating buyers and sellers, or demand and supply. Rather, it's a creative force that precedes and is the condition of all pricing. Basically, he's doing the same kind of work as Epidurai in thinking about how these markets post-2008 were still operating. My interest in some of this financial language is that it perfectly accords with the sort of negotiations on Greece and the Greek crisis and the mentality behind it. That, someone like Varoufakis comes in as a finance minister. He has ex-IMF people. He has the best people. He has MIT engineers and mathematicians who are now involved in unwinding bankruptcy, national bankruptcies, and they have plans for doing it. People with whose planning is quite substantial in the world of economics. And what he constantly runs into is people who absolutely don't care about these things. What they care is a sort of narrative that's grown and taking place. And this sense of the narrativizing of what's happening in Europe sort of takes on, it just becomes, I would describe it as a monster at some point. It becomes the dominant mode for thinking about European finances at all. This is almost apropos of nothing. I just find it to reinforce some of what I'm talking about. There's a meeting in 2012. The Eurogroup was a group of unelected finance people and ministers who basically made all the decisions for Eurozone finances. Van Rompuy was the head of it. And they went into a meeting in which, at the time, during this meeting, Europe was really melting down. Italian bonds especially were being sold off very rapidly. There was fear that within hours, Italy would not be able to finance itself, that it could not go to the markets, that Italy was close to defaulting. And so they went into this meeting, and it was this top secret meeting. No one was reporting from it. Suddenly this tweet appeared. Autumn and November, the night has fallen. The bare branches can be seen, even more lonely. Because of this tweet, there was a massive run on Italian bonds. Basically, they went from something like the basis points, they were running at 2%, they were up to 10% because of this. This was the mentality of the markets and private investing, that the euro was done at this point in 2012. He had been tweeting haikus for years on Twitter, and no one noticed. So just the reading into this mundane haiku was quite interesting. In Germany, I never knew anything about this. The figure of the old oak is a sort of, in German lore, its symbolic power. There were constant references to this. Like, Greek finance people would have conversations in negotiations about oak trees with Germans. The oak tree is a figure for Germans that's even pre-Christian. Its history is throughout the history of Germany. It was used in the Second Reich. I think it's used on German money, but the way that its symbolic powers were used were in talking about stable foundations, the sort of the sturdy oak, the thing you can rely on. I can say that even in my reading of Greek mythology, I never really ran across the oak much, but the Greek interlocutor, the finance minister, said, well, you know, Greeks also think of the old oak. It's associated with Zeus, and there's an old oak tree, this oracular oak tree that the ancients used to go to in order to hear the voice of Zeus. And it's basically, for Greeks, they would hear in the lightning and thunder that hit this tree the voice of Zeus. So for Greeks, it's a mystery. What is the thunder saying? So they would have this conversation. I didn't make too much of it. I do, now that I think, after I read this, I was thinking back. I'm gonna talk a little bit about Thomas Bernhard in a few minutes, but I read a novel by Thomas Bernhard called The Cheap Eaters years ago, and I didn't think anything of his use of the old oak, but the whole novel is about how this character and his friend every day would walk to an old oak tree in the park, and once they get into the oak tree, they dance around the same conversation they always have, some kind of philosophical conversation. And that one day, they were in the midst of conversation on this walk, and they basically bypassed the path to the oak tree. They just forgot about it, and they ended up on the other side of the park at an old ash tree. And it's at the old ash tree where, for the first time, there's some kind of freedom and possibility for them. So this happened constantly. There were conversations about the ant and the Aesop's, the ant and the grasshopper, the worker ants, the grasshopper poet. I should ask Damien about James Joyce's, or Joe, James Joyce's Grace Hopper, isn't it like
Aunt. Grace. And the Grace Hooper.
The Grace Hooper.
Grace Hooper.
Isn't the Grace Hooper like a pleasure-seeking writer?
He hopes.
But isn't that what's valorized?
He's Shannon Penman.
Right.
And the aunt is Sean the Post. Sean the Post is sturdy,
But who's valorized?
Who's valorized? That's a complicated question.
Okay.
Everyone and no one.
All right. So if the Germans are talking about the old oaks, the Greeks got into it over Dante's Inferno. This was the big thing in Greece. And it comes off a Constantine Cavafy poem that is on the Inferno, Che fece il gran rifiuto. For some people, the day comes when they have to declare the great yes or the great no. It's clear at once who has the yes ready within him. In saying it, he goes from honor to honor, strong in his conviction. He who refuses does not repent. Asked again, he'd still say no. Yet that no, the right no, drags him down all his life. In running for prime minister in 2015, Alexis Tsipras promised the Greek people that he would deliver to the Troika, the finance people who were putting Greece in this awful place. He would deliver to them the great no. This has other significance in Greece because, probably the idea of the first great no coming off of the Cavafy poem comes into play during World War II when Mussolini gave the Greek prime minister an ultimatum to surrender within hours. The lore goes that the prime minister wrote a one-word response back, ohi, which is no, just no, we're not going to surrender. And this no it's celebrated today. I think like October 25th is Ohi Day in Greece. I've never been there on that day. I don't know if people just go around like refusing. We should have this in academia, and it would come at a good time. October is the perfect time actually to say no to things. But anyway, so obviously with the war, the Italians invaded. They were defeated, the Germans invaded, they destroyed Greece. 10% of the population died mainly from starvation. So in that case, the prime minister's no, you can make an easy case for it. Indeed, it was the one that dragged them down all their lives. The poet George Safiris, long before Alexei Tsipras employed this as one of his planks in running for prime minister, said, "There's a pompous misuse of the phrase the great no. Dante is not praising them, but declaring them to be cowards. Those who use it that way don't know what they're talking about." This is incredibly prophetic because this gets to what happened on that fateful night. It also gets back to the line of the middle finger controversy. It gets back to the time when Tsipras was supposed to deliver the no, the big no, and what happened on that night, which I'm not going to get to right now. Some of my models, so if you're getting a sense that I'm sort of going back and forth with some of the sort of dramatic, tragicomic debate, some of my models in fiction for doing this, I'm just going to describe them briefly. This is the only part of the presentation that's not actually in the novel, but some of the people I've been thinking of. I've been thinking of them not only because all the people the three novelists I'm going to mention here are writing about real events. Their books are not fictional. They're writing novels now. They are, and all three of them are primarily thinking of modes of expression. They're working with sort of what I describe as oppositional phrasing. They're working with hyperbole. They're chiefly concerned in how they are to tell a real story. Some of them, like Rybnik, is political. He's talking about 20th century European history. His quote in what he's trying to do, this is inside the novel this quote comes from. "The primary question wasn't to know what events, what episodes were characteristic of the 20th century, but which syntax, which rhetoric, which expressiveness belonged to it." Let me see if I could find this. Just trying to get a list of what his history actually juxtaposes. So Rybnik's history of the 20th century is concerned primarily with information rather than historical narrative. In this spirit, the book's many comparisons and contrasts of topics discusses philosophy, psychology, the moon landing to Barbie dolls. You can ask, like, how is this European history? The death of humanism, the ethics of Amish people, and the rise in the popularity of pets. So for him, this is like this attempt to produce this sheer information juxtaposed really mostly against odd facts about, the numbers of people that died in World War II, but sort of subcategories of what happened to those people. I think of this book as being actually quite powerful and very emotive, whereas he wants it to be flat. But the central question is, how does history produce meaning? And that in this lining up of facts, the production of Barbie dolls, the proliferation of pets alongside World War II, what kind of affect kind of squawks out of that? These questions of how do you write about political events, current events, thinking about, or even alongside personal stories, these are mainly what I was thinking about before I launched into all of this, and what the rhetorical value would be of all these different modes of expression, and what would I choose, how would I tell it? This is Peter Handke, Sorrow Beyond Dreams, which is just, it's odd because this one is supposed to be about his mother's suicide, but it's really about pre-war Germany, and how he wants to describe his mother basically having no other characteristics other than being, a Frau in pre-war Germany. And so he does this in curious ways. I'll just describe what his project is, or I'll read from it. "There are two dangers, one of merely telling of what happened, and two, of a human individual becoming painlessly submerged in poetic sentences. These dangers have slowed my writing because in every sentence I'm afraid of losing my balance. This is true of every literary effort, but especially in this case. Consequently, I first took the facts as my starting point and looked for ways to formulate them. But I soon noticed, in looking for formulations, I was moving away from the facts. I then adopted a new approach, starting not with the facts, but with the already available formulations, the linguistic deposit of man's social experience. I compared, sentence by sentence, the stock formulas applicable to the biography of a particular life, the actual work of writing that follows from the agreements and contradictions between them. The essential is to avoid mere quotations, even when sentences look quoted. So to me that portrays a method of how he was going to go about solving one of his main problems. His biggest problem is he absolutely wanted to refuse to present his mother as anything that remotely resembled a literary character. If there was any literariness in his effort, according to him, this would be a colossal failure. So the question would be how to describe this life using, either hearsay, gossip, anecdotal information, and to present it as an authentic life without making it in any way emblematic of the kinds of lives women such as his mother led. So this is Bernhard, and he's writing about his friend Paul Wittgenstein, which is Ludwig Wittgenstein's nephew. And with Bernhard, I just wanted to give you the sense of how he uses both hyperbole and oppositional writing. And this goes across all of his novels, really. Bernhard's mode of description is to exaggerate as much as he possibly can, and to contradict those exaggerations. What does it mean that a text is completed, then completed again? By totally correcting it, until it means the opposite of its original meaning. And this is from Wittgenstein's nephew. It might be said that Paul succumbed to madness because he one day lost control, just as I succumbed to lung disease because I one day lost control. Paul went mad because he suddenly pitted himself against everything and lost his balance, just as one day I too lost my balance through pitting myself against everything. The only difference being that he went mad, whereas I, for the selfsame reason, contracted lung disease. But Paul was no madder than I am. I am at least as mad as he was said to be, though I have lung disease, in addition to my madness. The only difference between us is that Paul allowed himself to be utterly dominated by his madness, whereas I have exploited mine. So these are just, in thinking about writing, and thinking about the rhetoric of writing about real events, just models that I consider using. I'm not gonna really get into all of this because I know there's a time thing. I can't, I timed this talk, but now in the connection with these devices, what I'm looking at is totally different than what I was looking at home. So I can't see anything. So I'm gonna guess I'm approaching the way over mark, and I'll just say. This is called Myths of the Greek Crisis. It's actually an article presented by Nick Malkoutsis, who is the Nate Silver of Greece. This is just a fantastic website for sort of independent information about the Greek crisis. These are the main myths about Greece. He just shows how they're all totally wrong. Greece falsified statistics, it didn't. In order to join the Eurozone, there's proof of it. Greeks went on a spending binge. There's an article out there that says in the city of Salonika in Greece, you will find more Porsche Cayennes registered than in the whole of Europe. This was like huge national news in Europe. It's untrue, is what I'm trying to say. Greeks don't work enough. They actually work longer. They're unproductive, but they actually work very long hours. Greeks retire in their 50s, well, 65, close. Tax evasion is a national pastime. That one's actually a problem, but does not nearly rise to the level of causing Greece collects an enormous amount of tax revenue. The fact that some people pay a hell of a lot of taxes and other people don't does not cause their economic meltdown. Greece spends too much on its public sector. Its expenditures were much lower than other European countries. Euro taxpayers are funding Greek budget spending. Since 2012, Greece has had a primary budget surplus paying for all its expenditures governmentally. All the money that was going to pay down Greek debt was getting sent from European coffers directly to the central bank, which allowed them to basically recompense the bank. So in that sense, the total budget, right? The money, European taxpayer money, was helping them pay their debt, but it wasn't helping them with their domestic spending. The one that is not Malkoutz's, but is mine, do you guys, I'm just curious, maybe you'll raise your hand. Did you ever come across articles that said Goldman Sachs helped Greece hide their statistics and lie to enter into the Eurozone? Did you ever see this? No. Okay. This was a thing at one point. Basically, the idea was that Goldman Sachs entered into derivative tradings with Greece that showed that their debt was a lot lower than it really was. And the reason why this is significant is this allowed people who were arguing that we need to recapitalize the private banks that lent to Greece by converting Greek debt into European taxpayer debt, that we have to do it because the Greeks lied. We have to do it because Goldman Sachs helped them fudge their statistics, and that the bankers are not at fault, essentially. This is the heart of that argument. And in point of fact, actually, the Goldman Sachs scheme, they did do a derivatives deal with Greece. It was fully described back in 2003. There was all this talk, not only about Greece's deal with Goldman Sachs, but multiple countries had done it. There were divisions in Europe between the stat people, the accountants, and the finance people, the debt managers, because they were hiding debt all over the place. It was well known. This comes from an article in which basically the controversy was laid out. When countries sell sovereign bonds and they owe money to other countries, someone keeps track of that. There are really international clearinghouses keep track of that. It's not as though you could get money from someone and they would forget that they owed it to you. That rarely, I don't know if that's ever happened, but it didn't happen in this case either. But it was a convenient canard, because if you can blame Goldman Sachs for entering into this illegitimate deal with Greece, then you can construct something. I mean, granted, there's the Greek malfeasance of not paying back their loans. There's that. But if you could also say that they did this illegally, then you can construct an argument that says the European taxpayers, not only German taxpayers, these are German banks and French banks that loan to Greece. You can construct an argument that says that private debt needs to be shifted onto the public, the European tax-paying public. So this is why the Goldman Sachs argument came into being in the first place. What it hides, this is the breathtaking part of all of this. What it hides is the corruption in Greece and in Europe. This guy was angry because this is the former defense minister. His cousin ratted on him. And he said, my cousin's only doing it because he wants to escape prosecution. And then this is a positively Trumpian line. I remind you that I served Greece for 30 years and knew a lot of well-known citizens and politicians. Of course I knew the part that they all played. We all judge and are judged. Today I'm not just being judged, but I've been thrown into a modern-day Colosseum created for political reasons. My turn to judge will come. By exposing the whole truth, everyone will have to take on his share of the responsibility. And I take him at his word, actually. I'm pretty sure he knows a bunch of people. This is the incredible thing about all this. The 73-year-old minister is accused of pocketing as much as 2 billion euros. Okay, that's a typo. It's got to be 2 million, right? Well, when you look at all these bribery deals, they were all in the hundreds of millions. I think this guy really took $2 billion, which, I mean, we're talking about the total of the Greek debt is like 280 billion. If you got one guy taking 2 billion in bribes, this was another deal, an 80 million euro deal for 4 submarines. They only got 2 of the submarines. But here's the crazy thing about it. They just didn't care what they were even buying. The submarines they got from this company, as soon as they put them into the warm Aegean water, keeled over and were floating sideways. They were designed for like the cold North Sea. So this was just, it was absolutely bizarre. When Tsipras went to Angela Merkel and said, do you think there's any complicity here with corporations, multinational corporations bribing Greek officials? She replied, not only that, why did you bought them, but you owe us money for the other 2 submarines we're gonna build. Greece had to basically sell these submarines at a cost to third parties. There are estimates that the total Greek armament in these corruption scandals is something like $150 billion. These things are never prosecuted. The one guy got prosecuted, but there's no push in Europe to prosecute all these things. And finally, when the negotiations, this is back in 2010, that's when the bailout negotiations with Greece started. Nicolas Sarkozy basically said to the Greeks, if you want a bailout deal for your debt, you're going to have to buy hundreds of millions of dollars in military weaponry from us, or we're not doing it. This is just a quid pro quo. This is Nick Whitney is the ex-head of the European Defense Agency who's talking about how this quid pro quo happened. So this shows you, I mean, when you're talking about billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in corruption, that can account for the kind of debt a country may owe. Is anyone keeping track of time? Because I don't have it up here.
It's 5:14.
Does that mean
That means
45 minutes or so I've been going?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're okay if you want to say.
This will be as brief as I can possibly make it.
That's okay.
This is where Varoufakis falls on his sword. This is, in Germany it's known as Stinkfingergate. And it's probably the most dramatic moment of the whole crisis because it's perfectly underscored by the silliness of it all.
Kiss schreibt Artikel, gibt Interviews und dreht Videos, in denen die Krise erklärt.
The rich had one answer, but the poor struggled more than ever.
Varoufakis will den Griechen neues Selbstvertrauen geben.
Greece should simply announce that it is defaulting
Und steht für klare Botschaften, besonders an Deutschland.
and stick the finger to Germany and say, well, you can now solve this problem by yourself.
This drove people mad. I mean, he was the biggest scoundrel because if you put it in context, Germans are giving Greeks all this money. And here's the finance minister saying, we don't want your money. We're just going to say, we're not paying you, and on top of it, we're going to give you the middle finger. This was presented on the top German news show. And to say he was vilified, I mean, is really, he was, a lot worse happened to him. Basically, he was immediately thrown off negotiations. The Europeans said that if he was representing Greece, that everything was over, everything was done. And it was because of this Stinkfinger incident. Now, it gets weirder, because when this was presented to Varoufakis to answer for it, he said that video has been doctored. So I was like, who doctored this video? And I sympathize with him because I could replay this. You have the German translation that's going over it, taking away the context. First of all, this happened 3 years before he became finance minister. It happened at the Subversive Festival in Croatia. And it was put in the form of a hypothetical. What he was saying was, if back in 2010, before the bailout, all the debt was written under Athenian law, essentially that means that Greece could have given a haircut to it through Athenian law or converted it to drachmas. And that if Greece had done that at that point, it would have been a huge European problem. It would have been Germany's problem. And the reason why Varoufakis was saying this, that this was an option back then, is he wanted to underscore that by entering into this bailout, this would mean that the Europeans also owed something to Greece. That the only reason why Greece would do this was, in other words, not have its debt cut or forgiven or whatever, was because there was a potential for some kind of European conflagration. If investors realize that debt that's denominated under each country's law can be just chopped, if you know that the assets that you're investing can lose value just by the decree of a politician, then why would you invest in European countries that are not the strong European countries that don't have these massive debts? The assumption until then was that the European Central Bank, the European institutions would vouchsafe all debt in all the countries. And with Greece, we finally had the possibility of a Eurozone country who would default on its debt. So this meant to all investors, wait a minute, my money isn't safe. So this just caught fire across Europe. What Varoufakis is essentially saying is if Greece, by going along, contributed to the European cause and is therefore owed something in all of this. There was a moment in which that 2010 bailout agreement, the PM of Greece who went along with the bailout, his name's George Papandreou. He was shown what the actual deal was, how there would be a conversion of private banking debt into European taxpayer debt, and it would all be written under London law, which meant if Greece ever failed in the future, if Greece ever got knocked out of the euro, it would always owe its debt amounts in euro, even though it had to devalue national currency to try to pay it. In other words, Greece would never get out from under the debt. When Papandreou saw this, he balked. Sarkozy, if you remember Nicolas Sarkozy, he flipped his lid, and in front of all these EU heads of state, he screamed, his exact words is, "You are a raving psychopath." I don't know what that means to anyone, but in this talk that Varoufakis is giving, he's returning to the scene of that drama and replaying it and showing what Greece's options were at the time. Okay. Varoufakis says the thing was doctored. In Germany, the newspaper said falsified. I don't know if there's a mistranslation there, but my sense was that Varoufakis was really talking about the voiceover and the lack of context, that's what the doctoring was. This is what I thought was going on. Then a German comedian got in on the act. Oh, I'm sorry. This Greece giving Germany the middle finger was a constant refrain long before Varoufakis, February 2010, a cheater in the Euro family. So this is Jan Böhmermann. Do you guys know this guy? He's appeared on Jimmy Kimmel and Colbert. He's like known as a big European comedian. Anyway, this is in German. I was trying to cut it down or find some kind of captioning. I could not do it, but you have to see what they did, even if you don't understand German, essentially.
Von Februar diesen Wie Frau Varoufakis-Song vorbereitet. Und da brauchten wir noch Originalmaterial vom echten Varoufakis, und das gab es damals noch nicht so. Und dann müssen wir halt was suchen. Und ich glaube, das war das ein Kongress in Kroatien, Zagreb 2013. Und da gab es tatsächlich ein paar Passagen drin, die für unser Leben ganz interessant waren.
If now the euro goes, we're going to have a massive depression in Germany and stagflation in the rest of Europe.
Wie kriegt man einen Draht nach Kroatien? Das ist nicht leicht. Nicht leicht.
Srećom teča govorim hrvatski učinjivati iz Hrvatske, imenu prijateljicu iz Zagreba, koja je radila za Super Z festival 2013. I da, pozdravimo vas, Bogdina, Bogdina.
Bogdina!
Bog Njemačka, Bog Neo Magazin Royal, pozdravljam Guntera Jauka i Janisa Varoufakisa i žao mi je.
Das war Kroatisch.
And stick the figure to Germany and say, well,
Es gibt eine Stelle in diesem Vortrag, wo er sagt, stick the finger to Germany. Das ist völlig unverfänglicher Kontext, indirekte Rede. Also er sagt nicht wirklich, dass er den deutschen Klingelfinger zeigen möchte. Aber wir dachten, wäre eine gute Idee, wenn er auf stick the finger to Germany auch den Finger zeigt. Und haben mal ein bisschen was ausprobiert.
Well, can I make a very simple point that
It appears to be real. The audio that claimed that the actual gesture was smooth, the shadows remained in place where they would be. I would assume it would be impossible if the whole take wasn't done in a studio.
Aufgabe Fachis, Szene 15, Take 12.
Es waren schon sehr aufwendige Dreharbeiten.
Also hier kann man zum Beispiel sehen, die können die Hand einfach frei platzieren, um zu sehen, wo genau sie dran passt, ob der Arm noch länger sein muss oder kürzer, weil wenn wir es einfach reinsetzen, offensichtlich der Arm viel zu lang ist. Da arbeitet man natürlich viel mit Tricks, sodass einfach das realistisch aussieht, indem man ein Motion Blur drauflegt. So funktioniert das natürlich viel besser. Und wir haben uns natürlich viel Mühe gegeben, einfach das realistisch wirken zu lassen, indem wir einfach die Schatten auch wirklich angepasst haben auf Details, dass man nicht sofort erkennen kann, da ist was gemacht worden.
It appears to be real.
Aber zum Glück gibt es Internet-Experten, ne?
So, this show came on and just basically claimed that they had doctored the video and put the middle finger up there and that Varoufakis hadn't done that. It would seem obvious, just in the tone, even if you don't know German, that this is all satire. But what happened next, this is where it truly gets weird. Varoufakis tweets. His first tweet came at 6:30 on March 18th, the day after this was shown, and he recognized it as humor, satire, and self-deprecation are great solvents of blind nationalism, and politicians need you badly. This was an acknowledgement, I think, that this was a whole satire, that he had given him the middle finger, that they hadn't, doctored the video. The tweet that made headlines and that really killed him, though, was the second tweet, which happened at 9:26, 3 hours before the first one, which seems not to have understood possibly that it was satire at all. Any apology in the offing, Guter Jack, that's the moderator who accused him, who said he had given him the for having used the doctored video to silence a conciliatory Greek voice. And of course, it was as though he didn't realize that he had given, forget the gesture, he actually said, give Germany the middle finger. So it doesn't, I don't know if it even matters if whether he actually did it or not. But this is the one that killed him, because on top of giving Germany the middle finger as an ingrate, he was now also, he was a big liar, essentially. Although, given this earlier tweet, I thought that, he obviously understood it was satire, so I thought possibly that he was referring to the lack of context, which Bowerman, the comedian, had also spoken about. I'm going to wrap this up. There's a little bit more that gets involved with, here's where he
He
realizes.
did me a lot of harm as a Minister of Finance. But I have to say that I appreciated the quality of his satire. I thought it was done in very good taste, despite the cost it had on me. And
the cost on Greece. So I think with that video a year later, Varoufakis acknowledges that he understands the video was not doctored. This is just Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was the IMF director during the time of the initial Greek bailouts and the pressure put on Greece. He was ignominiously, he was accused of raping a woman in a hotel in New York City and deposed. Several years later, he came back and tweeted about everything that had gone on in the IMF dealings to deal with the Greek debt. He largely agreed with Varoufakis. His proposal for what the IMF should have done was even much more radical and to Greece's benefit than what Varoufakis wanted. And this was basically once Varoufakis was deposed and thrown out, Greece was dealt an ultimatum. They had nowhere to go. Basically, the prime minister was groveling. And it was this incredibly weird moment in which Greece was basically told to give up the family jewels, basically everything in Greece would be up for sale. And this was a deal he could not accept, so he put this deal, this was after Varoufakis was gone, he put this deal up to a referendum in Greece. And Tsipras fully expected the Greeks to vote yes to the deal being offered, because the one thing Greeks wanted was to remain in the euro and the eurozone, and they believed that by voting no in the referendum that they would be tossed out. Well, what happened was the referendum went overwhelmingly in favor of the no. 65% of Greeks voted to reject the European ultimatum. And as soon as they voted no, which was Tsipras's promised big no, he turned around the next morning and accepted the deal. He had all along wanted a yes, which would allow him to accept the ultimatum. So he was pushing for a no, he wanted a yes. The Europeans were on the flip side doing something just as weird, as they were offering an ultimatum and hoping that the Greeks would say no. Because by saying yes to this horrendous package, Greece would be weakened, essentially, and it would continue to be a European headache. So you had two bad actors on both sides, one hoping for a no and getting a yes, and one hoping for a yes and getting a no. This was bonkers. Basically, maybe it's Brexit writ all over again. I'm going to end it there.
We have some time for questions if you'd like to pick something.
Sure. Yes. Chris?
So this is not a question about what you did talk about, but a question about what you didn't talk about. So how does your novel actually work? That is to say, is it in a single voice? Is it a pastiche? Is it
It's actually this is the last frame that I was going to address this at length. It is in a single voice. Actually, in the mode of narration is from one single point of view. I put Julio Cortázar's novel, Multinational Vampires, because he's the primary model structurally for what I was thinking about doing. This novel is just about something called the Russell Tribunal. He deals, what Cortázar does in this novel is he deals with a historical time when there was an investigation into CIA and American dealings in South America in the early 1970s. There was what was called the Russell Tribunal, an investigation that gathered in Rome in 1974. So what Cortázar did is he wrote a fiction, essentially about that tribunal and the meetings. And what I take from Cortázar is he did it at street level, which basically means he has minor characters that aren't in Varoufakis and these politicians. It's part of what I consider like the autobiography, but in any of these fictions, yes, things like national politics can be discussed. Things like artifacts that reveal some of the secrets being kept can be discovered. And I don't actually have to go too far. I think that in terms of the dramatic moments in this entire story, there's a lot there that Greece is a small enough country that these people are out and about, running into other people. And there was a time in which, in the midst of all the madness, Varoufakis was eating at a restaurant in his old neighborhood, and 150 motorcycle-wearing anarchists came and beat the hell out of them. So there's a lot of interaction between nameless people on the street and the ministers and a lot of just, there's a lot of ways to dramatize that moment. Those have not been written yet. That's what I intend. The autobiography that happens in Ia has been written, and this is the part I was writing this semester. It would have seemed totally uncontexted because I meant it as allegory, essentially, to be juxtaposed against this. It deals with children and sexual assault and pedophilia, and it's maybe Nabokovian in that sense, so I don't see, if it's not juxtaposed against this, the allegory doesn't work. But it's a single narrator. I really wanted it. Cortázar actually uses Fantomas, which is this comic book character. It's weird. In his fiction, the tribunal, the historical event, is narrativized in just ordinary prose. It's, you could be reading Truman Capote. But the sort of metafictional aspects, Fantomas, appear in these comic book style, multimodal settings off to the side. And in those, in Cortázar, you get something like political commentary. For my purposes, I wanted to make it a lot more seamless. I wanted everything to happen within that single narrative line. Jamie and John?
I mean, it's kind of like a sort of very obvious question, and it's sort of a bit of a stupid question, but nevertheless, I'm interested. Because your presentation is kind of quite documentary, right? I mean, you're kind of talking about this, and here's what happened, and here's the stuff going on, and sort of, close to, talking about history, right? So, just on a very basic level, why write a novel rather than write a history? I mean, just for you, what's the appeal of the novel as a form for talking about, for you particularly, I don't mean like a grandiose statement about,
I think the novel...
why the novel for you for history rather than your, sophisticated and very extensive knowledge of all of the documentation and piecing it together, and, you presented us with a history today, right? And yet you're writing you're writing a novel. So where does that work for you as a novelist? The shift from one to the other, because you are somebody who has, because I know you well, right? You have this very intense relationship to contemporary history and thinking about it, and yet you also are a novelist. So how is that shift working for you in the production of this piece?
I mean, at some level, the sort of glib answer is I think a novel could do it better. But that's it's probably not true. But it's why I want to write it in fiction at base. But the other answer is to think of a way of capturing the ways the rhetoric is working within this drama. Like, if I want to present a full-throated defense of Greece while I sound batshit crazy, if I want to get involved in a screed, I want to make that one pole of the fiction. Whereas in a straight history, like, why would I do that? And if I can juxtapose it against, and this is probably anecdotal, like I could find a lot of evidence for this within contemporary modern Greek literature, that the notion of expiation or the confessional is there. And it's not only in my anecdotal experience of speaking with Greeks who do this a lot. Like, Varoufakis does this every other minute of the day. We'll go into like confessional mode. It's his main form of rhetoric. But to explore that, I think this is why, like, you wouldn't do this in history. That rhetorical question of adopting the narrative pose that's either in a mode of confessional would not be done in a history book, nor would the screed where someone's pulling their hair out be done either. So I was very interested in thinking of these two modes rubbing up against each other, essentially. This is what I think the fiction affords me. I mean, I'm a lot less interested, let's say, in any sort of question of the factual versus the fictional or anything like that. I really want to tell the story of the Greek crisis in terms of the rhetoric that's being used to move it. I mean, I think Badiou was right. Badiou's quote is just that, the moment for real politics came within the hours of the referendum that said no, and it was lost. And he said in history, those moments never come around again. And I think that's true. That's why you don't hear anything more about the crisis, because the sad part of this is for Greece, this debt does not get written off until the year 2060. And until then, they have to maintain budget surpluses of 3.5% yearly in order to pay off the debt. That's never been done before, even over a span of 10 years. One country did it, Norway, sustained it for 10 years, but no other country in the world has ever maintained a budget surplus like that. So, it's kind of the end until 2060 for them. So I think the drama and the absurdity, like Stinkfingergate, figuring so strongly, there's bigger reasons why Stinkfingergate is important is because Varoufakis had the goods in the plan and figured out how to stay within the Eurozone, even while the Europeans were shutting down Greek banks. And once he was gone, there were moments in which people in Greece said, we don't know how to do this without him. He's really quite brilliant in this respect. So this is why. John?
Okay. Listening to the first part of your talk, when you were talking about finance and the different ways of taking up what markets do. And then there was a shift in the second part of your talk that wasn't stuff that's not in the novel. That's about writing and about writing method. And I found an analogy between the two, and I just like to hear your thoughts on it, and to know if that's where you were going with it. So it seems like there's this way of treating the markets as if they are a reflection or a representation of value. And then there's this other way of treating the markets, which is invested in performativity, credibility, faith, the future. And it's sort of a poetics, right, of what a market can do, right? Then in writing, you had the one fellow, I'm sorry, I don't remember their names, but the one fellow who was like, had this great, I thought great, description of trying to write about his mother's death, and I can just say what happened, or I can get lost in the poetics, and my problem is keeping my balance. Right? And it seems like the problem with respect to the markets is keeping one's balance. That is to say that if one goes too far into the poetics of the future, one winds up with derivatives, and you're walking on air until you look down and then you fall and collapse. On the other hand, if you just take the market as a reflection of present value, you don't invest in Amazon in the 1980s, you don't invest in Amazon in the 1990s, and you wind up losing a big opportunity to make a lot of money. Okay? So it seems like there's a kind of balance that is at work in both of them, that there's some kind of hooking on to poetics and what happened in the writing method. Maybe that's why a novel and not a history, but a certain kind of novel, right? But there also seems to be that same way that one needs to think about markets, that they're neither simply a reflection of a present state of value, nor simply a story about the future, or, that either one of those is a significant arc. Does that analogy hold?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also holds in a natural sense that if my interests are in the way this sort of symbolic thinking happens in, well, let's say in writing, both in the realm of economics, but also in fiction. You could say like Kay's test of faith is the exact same thing as the suspension of disbelief in fiction. It's a really odd thing. I've had students accuse me, when I've given them critiques of their fiction back, of being incapable of experiencing pleasure in the reading of their fictions, and I'm perturbed by it. So, what do you mean? You can't just enjoy my story. You have to critique it. And what does that mean? And what it comes down to for them is, in talking to them about it, is they want to know if I've ever suspended my disbelief in the process of reading their fiction. And I think in many of the ways, we're as a fiction writing academic, I'm cultured out of the suspension of disbelief. So this question of something like the test of faith interests me almost at at an academic level. Like, how does suspension of disbelief happen in the first place? How does this test of faith happen in the first place? So I'm naturally interested in it. If I don't want to write about those 3 fiction writers that I mentioned to you, it's because I think my interest in those writers and in what was going on with Epidurai and Ayashi is really about the same idea as you've stated. But in some ways, I'm predated by those writers too, like Urednik and Europeana, who wrote Europeana in the early 2000s, wrote about quants on Wall Street and how their efforts would destroy the future. And he has these great lines about the mathematical algorithms that mean nothing. And it's like that was actually the heart of the derivative meltdown, as we hired engineers from MIT to figure out how to disassociate insurance from the assets that a bank owns, that it would have these quants figured out algorithms that would basically measure how these things are traded in the markets. And so Urednik was there way before me. I mean, this is why I'm writing about the Greek crisis, because I can talk about the Greek crisis and not what Urednik already knows about what precisely you said. I think it's eerie and bizarre that someone who's thinking about rhetoric or fiction or modes of expression is hitting upon these ideas that, Ayashi especially was, you couldn't have more negative reactions towards a book on finance from economists and financial people, except for some of the top dogs. Some of the top economists admitted that this is in large part what's happening now in the world of finance. But, Epidurai sensed that the history of economics as we think of it now, once you have the world of derivatives, is based on error, basically invalidates a whole discipline. So people like Epidurai or Urednik, who writes about this, do put it into the realm of, even John Kay at the Financial Times called it magic, thinks of it as magic. I do. My answer would be, I think the fact that there was an analogy there just comes from my interest in that symbolic thinking and that mode of expression and how it might operate within fiction, or why fiction might be an appropriate treatment of this at all.
Why don't we take one last question and then
I
we
think
can talk.
it was both Chad and
Like 2
Chad,
quick
right?
ones if you want to.
Might be irrelevant. I'm just thinking when you're talking about like the confessional of the Greeks, and it's different in terms of the Eurozone and European Union, but how Iceland dealt with a similar time frame, very differently. And if that was something that you reflected on or investigated, or was it just something?
Well, that's the heart of the middle finger. That's Varoufakis' hypothetical. He's saying, what if Greece pulled an Iceland?
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. If Greece had done, because Iceland did give the middle finger. All that debt was held by private investors and European banks in Icelandic banks, and they just wrote it off. And there were massive losses. And no one holds it against. Greece is going to be feeling this till 2060. Iceland is probably not over it. Argentina is not over it. But they'll do much better than Greece will, those 2 countries. But I think that's exactly what Varoufakis was talking about in that middle finger speech. He was thinking about Iceland.
Give them the Iceland?
Versus give them the Iceland is essentially what he's talking about. All right. Thank you.